I'm Joe Fewsmith, Director of the Center for the Study of Asia at BU, and Adil gave me the opportunity to welcome you. One of the things that the Center for the Study of Asia does is collaborate with different centers and schools around the university, and one of our favorite partners is, of course, the Pardee Center, and we've collaborated with them on a certain conference on China that's represented in an edited volume back there in the cabinet. And it's a pleasure to collaborate again, and we're looking forward to doing so in the future. One of the first things that we did when we were established as a center was have a conference on the topic, what is Asia? And like all good academic conferences, we did not answer the question, therefore paving the way for a second discussion on what is Asia. And well, you'll do the introduction, won't you? Sure. This takes off, I have to mention it, it takes off, I guess, from Bob Hefner's presidential address at the Association for Asian Studies discussing the concept of Asia, which has come out with responses in the Journal of Asian Studies. And of course, to comment also are long-term students of Asia, David Eckel, Department of Religion, student of Buddhism, and of course, Eugenio Menegon, professor of history, student of, well, everything. Lots of things. The only thing that I'll say is we are a center for the study of Asia rather than an East Asia center. We take the idea of Asia as a continent seriously, the interactions, not only as countries, but as religions cross boundaries, resources, environments, and so forth. And so thank you for coming, and let me turn it over to Adil.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you could keep that just there. Thanks everyone again. We'll start the program formally, I guess, by first wishing you all a very happy Valentine's Day. You will note I'm carrying my red notebook, and we've given red ones to the two of them. I don't know if you got a red or a black, and I don't know what that means, but but we're on with the program. So this is exciting. Any good South Asian who remembers his 5th grade social studies, I remember Valentine's Day because it happens to be on the birthday of Zahiruddin Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire. So that's one way to learn learn about Valentine's Day. But I imagine all over Asia there are all sorts of reasons to remember dates, not just this one, but all sorts of others. And that's what we wanted to do today. This is really the classic format for this seminar series. We have colleagues from 3 different departments, from history, from anthropology, from religion, myself with a split personality between IR and geography. And if you think about those 5 departments, all have things to say about the subject, as I imagine would any other department in any other school. And that's really what makes this topic so fascinating. So without any further ado, all of my colleagues have thought hard and deep and long about these questions. What we want to do is to think about what is this thing called Asia, which we all seem to define somewhat differently. Why does it matter how we define it? Does it in fact matter how we define it? And does it matter especially in this age as we are looking towards more and more conversations that keep talking about things like Asia rising, Asia century, and so on and so forth? What does it mean to think of what Asia is? On that happy note, Eugenio, it's all yours.
First of all, I'd like to thank Adil for inviting us. As Joe suggested, go back to the question, what is Asia? The topic of our inaugural conference in April 2009 at the BU Center for the Study of Asia was the idea of Asia. I would like to thank Joe for embracing this idea and making also this possible. Well, first of all, we are all aware that the word Asia was first used by the Greeks and then the Romans to identify the civilizations and the peoples located to the east of their own lands, from Asia Minor, with today's Turkey, to India, all the way to the country of the mythical Ceres, the Chinese of those days. And the word Asia has survived to our day, and with it, the geographical idea of Asia, to which also we still tend to associate a lot of cultural ideas that sometimes are Orientalist in attitude and approach. So we have to say that Asia is, without doubt, an invention of what we today call the West. But even if it has become a linguistic borrowing in most Asian languages, the term has this weakness in itself. It is a label that is being imposed by others and not something that people have chosen themselves in Asia. A fact that is so obvious that sometimes we forget about it. It's true that we can find other similar cases for other geographical concepts. For example, a Chinese example, 中国, China. The modern Chinese, that's the way they call it. But until the late 19th century, this was hardly a concept reflecting a national entity in the Chinese language. The word 中国 existed, but it indicated for a long time what archaeologists would identify as the central plains of northern China, the mythical ancestral land of today's Chinese. So returning to our topic, the idea of Asia, like the idea and institutions of the nation state that have been imported from the West, this idea is being accepted and used by modern Asian intellectuals and authorities to advance their national causes and redefine their national or Asian identities, sometimes even to lay claims to each other's territories in search for a cultural but as well as political and military dominance. And this European artifact that is Asia has then been infused with new meanings, starting from experiences that are indigenous to the region, a topic that David and probably Bob will explore more. And as contemporary scholars, we can maybe try to escape the pool of these kind of words like Asia that we have been gotten used to by long usage. But maybe we will end up confusing our audiences. You probably are totally confused by now, right?
Not yet, but keep working.
So rather than becoming a cage, then, Asia can become a useful container. And I think that's the spirit of what we're doing here today, trying to define it for the future in light of the past. We'll hear from David and from Bob about the sacred landscapes of Asia, Asia as a region today. And religions have connected Asia in the past. And this process has not been always peaceful, sometimes fraught with violence, but certainly religion has been a unifying common denominator in history. In the 20th century, though, we have had a more violent approach that comes with the imposition of the nation states in Asia itself, with unifying and totalizing projects of these modern Asian nation states that sometimes have appealed to old cultural traits, to ancient religious practices as markers of difference. And we have already reflected in 2009 about some of these topics. But what is interesting is that this good idea of ours has been stolen by the Association for Asian Studies, so to say. And in November 2010, they've come out with an issue in the Journal of Asian Studies that reflects a forum entitled Asia Redux, Conceptualizing a Region for Our Times. And it contains a general address by Prasenjit Duara, who is an Indian intellectual, you could say, but who has become a scholar of China, and after his first training in India, has moved on to the United States, become a famous sinologist at the University of Chicago, and more recently have moved to the National University of Singapore, really showing sort of interesting Asian trajectory in his own personality. And the question of that forum, what started that forum was, how has Asia appeared as a region and being conceived as such in the last 100 years? So an approach that is, I would say, quite modern, looking at the period between the beginning of the 20th century and our days. And he says that he bases his own analysis on historical sociology. he says a region emerges unplanned over long periods of time, whereas regionalization is something that is more ideologically planned. And he traces a trajectory between 19th to early 20th century forms of imperialism in Asia, especially British imperialism, which created regional interdependencies in Asia, but also that were based on much older Asian maritime regional networks that go back to the 14th century, sometimes even earlier, and on which European-dominated patterns, so to say, rode to build up these new empires. These were true regions. Then instead he moves on to talk about the developments into the 20th century, in particular interwar new imperialism, dominated by Japanese imperialism in Asia, where there is an attempt to take over and modernize parts of Asia, as in the case of Manchukuo, the Japanese colony in northeast China, with this idea of a pan-Asian common space, which is akin to the nation, but that within creates a lot of hierarchies, a lot of layering, and a lot of injustices as well. And this turned out to be an unsustainable model of regionalization, according to Duara. And then he goes on to talk about how there was a reaction in Asia itself by intellectuals of Japan, China, and India against this forced ideological and economic regionalization. And he identifies some intellectuals in Japan early on, Okakura Kakuzo, Zhang Pinling in early 20th century China, and Tagore in India, as people who try to construct an idea of a cosmopolitan pan-Asianism, a peaceful one. And these thinkers were clearly ahead of their times. And in the end, these utopian ideals of a unified Asia based on the will of the peoples of Asia and their intellectuals was not realized. Because it was an abstract, an essentialized notion of culture and civilization that in many ways wanted to replicate, to mirror the Western conception of civilization. And finally, it comes to our times. And he says that in the 20th century, what we see is first a period of creation of confined spaces during the Cold War. And today, in part, we continue having the same kind of constraints that the Cold War has created in Asia, but also the production of social spaces under the control of the national state, which work within global capitalism. And he concludes his analysis saying that the earlier, pre-modern organizations of networks in Asia did not prevent borrowings, mixing, whereas the nation-state organization of Asia that comes with the modern era was a much more rigid way of dividing things, hardening this soft boundaries of the pre-national polities. And he concludes with a certain uncertainty is addressed, saying, are the economic challenges ahead of us going to bring back nationalist confrontations? Or rather, will we see, in the name of economic integration, regional alliances, transnational networks flourishing? And other people in the debate have responded to him. I only chose two of them, and I'm sure that the other speakers might talk about others in the debate. I've chosen Wang Hui, who is a Chinese famous intellectual who is less sanguine, less optimistic about the demise of the nation state. He talks of the nation state as still the main force in Asian relations. And also it talks of the fact that the idea of Asia today remains the preserves of elites and of intellectuals, and really doesn't reach down to the masses. So a less optimistic view of the idea of Asia. And then there is an historian, so I feel more at home there, St. Hansen, who talks about the intricacies of pre-modern Asian connections, long-term historical perspectives, which tell us that there has always been networks, there's always been connections in Asia, but that they were not limited to Asia. They connected outside with Europe, with Africa. He's also, so he has an optimistic look at the past, but at the same time he says there was a lot of conflict in the past as well. So the past does not necessarily provide us with a model for peace and harmony that we can replicate today. And so what I perceive from this forum is really not so much optimism for the future, but more a sense that we are faced with a lot of uncertainties. We don't know what is coming, and that maybe the past is not necessarily going to be the best teacher for the future.
Thank you very much. We at the Pardee Center are, of course, always dealing with uncertainty in the future that we don't know. Wonderful points raised, and I'll move to David, who many of us remember your keynote address at the conference that has been mentioned. In Eugenio's term, is Asia a cage, or has it been a more useful container?
Sure. Be glad to comment on that, Adil. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thanks to Shelley for organizing it, and to all of our colleagues for getting together another lively conversation on this question. I like to take a little bit of the blame for the presence of this question in our group, because it first was raised, I think, in a meeting before we had the BU Center for the Study of Asia. When we were first talking about it, we were sitting around the table trying to decide what should be included. And I said in that naive, completely offhanded, and perhaps indeed rather foolish way, well, the question that really concerns me is, what is Asia? And it then was picked up and became the basis of our discussion at that initial conference. And in the absence of Professor Hefner, who was called off elsewhere, who was much more qualified than I to speak about this question, I was asked to offer an answer. And I quickly discovered in that opening talk for our center that it's easier to ask a question like this than it is to answer it, as you can well imagine. And to frame an answer to the question at that conference, I went back to the Buddhist tradition, which is the locus of my own scholarly work, and one of the few Pan-Asian cultural movements that does have a sense of the region being tied together beyond national boundaries. And I looked for a symbolic framework that could be used to conceptualize the totality of the region that we designate today as Asia. And I explored in that talk the image of a mandala with a central point and then various points around the periphery of the mandala that are tied together by various relationships with the center. This is a spatial concept that is Indian in origin, but it is recreated often across Asia in various places that I imagine we've encountered. It's found in the spatial or sacred geography of the island of Bali in Indonesia. It's important in what's called the mandalic polity of traditional Thailand and Cambodia. It's found in very important ways in the sacred geography of Japan, and it's also, of course, found in the sacred geography of India and the Himalayas. Now, I won't say any more about that. I don't want to just repeat that talk, but this struck me as being an intriguing way to think of Asia as a series of relationships bound together by a certain symbolic organization of space. After reading Prasenajit Dwara's Asia Redux, which Eugenio has just mentioned, I'm tempted to add two new Buddhist strategies to the conceptualization of Asia, to this attempt to construct a sense of unity out of a congeries of disparate phenomena. The first of these may be familiar to some of you as the image of Indra's net. This is the governing image in the Huayan school of Chinese Buddhism. It's an image of reality as a network of jewels, in which each individual jewel in the net reflects the light of every other jewel. This image originated in India, but it had its greatest influence in China and Japan, especially in Zen, as in a famous passage from Dogen's Shobo Genzo that some of you may know. I don't know if it's often repeated in the Department of International Relations, but if it isn't, let it begin. At the next faculty meeting. That would be a good place for it. I'll just read a couple of lines. It's very familiar to people in the study of religion. Dogen says, "Know that there are myriads of forms and hundreds of grasses throughout the entire earth." You can sort of see where I'm going with this. It may take a while to get there, but we're on the way. Yes. And yet each grass and each form itself is the entire earth. The study of this is the beginning of practice. Each moment is all being, it is the entire world. Reflect now whether any being or any world is left out of the present moment. This is a Zen image of each moment as a jewel in the net of reality. So this is an image of reality, perhaps the image of a region, as a network in which parts within the network reflect the totality, if there indeed even is a totality of the network. Now there's another Buddhist image that is intriguing too and might be useful to us. This is the simplest image of reality of all. There is no simpler one in the Buddhist tradition. This is the image of reality simply as a river, as a trajectory of moments in something that we conventionally designate as a river. Now, if you put these two images together, you can think of Asia, so-called Asia in quotation marks, as a region, although even the word region probably should be mentioned in the same way, tied together by a network of different trajectories: trade, technology, religion, cultural exchange, violent confrontation, as in Tansen Sen's essay, and so on. This is a theme that was constantly replayed in these articles that we read in the JAAS, and I think is very salutary for us. It is a network of trajectories. Now, what appeals to me about all three of these Buddhist models is not just that they're open-ended and they have indeterminate boundaries, but they are all inherently anti-essentialist, because that's what the Buddhist tradition is all about. It's a critique of essences. And some of the ambivalence in the articles we read in the JAAS, especially the article by Dwara, that is the key article, is due to the fact that the authors have two interests. They want to talk about Asia as a nexus of cultural, political, or economic forces without attributing it any ultimate reality. And of course, that is a wonderful Buddhist project. What could be better? Buddhists have been treading this line for centuries, and they have well-developed strategies for talking in useful ways about things that don't exist. They even have a way of talking about a trajectory as if it were no trajectory at all. I have to share this with you, even though it's a little piece of esoterica that the Tibetans are the only ones, as far as I know, who have actually figured out. You can speak about a trajectory as a gyun in Tibetan. That means the stream of a river. But if you press a Tibetan debater right to the bitter end and ask, what is this so-called gyun? They will say, it's a gyu, which is only the moment, a single moment in the trajectory. And that's perhaps where we're leading, actually, in the way we speak about Asia. Now, Adil has asked at the very beginning of our talk why we would use the concept of Asia. If the concept is so open-ended and so insubstantial, why use it at all? We should ask that question. And I have two answers to that, which I'll offer and then turn things over to Bob. First of all, I think the concept forces us to ask what is included and what is left out. And that's a very salutary question for us to ask. This question comes up constantly in my Religion 103, which I think may be the biggest course that, as it were, introduces so-called Asia to undergraduates. It's a course in Asian religion. I can tell you stories about this, and I won't, but I would love to, about students asking me, where is Islam in your course? Where is it? A wonderful Sikh student who came to my door once and asked, are you Professor Eckel? Yes. Do you teach Religion 103? Yes. Do you realize that Sikhism is not mentioned in your course? Yes. Would you like to remedy this deficiency? It was a nice encounter. And that opened up to...
I'm intrigued by, and your answer was?
My answer was, oh, absolutely. And I invited him to join me the next semester, and he taught the week on Sikhism with me. It's wonderful. I still correspond with him. He's a very, very fine young man, actually. Not so young anymore, but a very, very fine person. And that opened up to me in a very vivid way the significance of Islam in Asia. You know, you cannot really understand religion in Asia without taking very, very seriously the presence of Islam as a unifying force in what we call Asia. And that opened up other modes of investigation for me. What about Korea? It seems to me Korea should be much better represented in a course like mine and is often overlooked, frankly, in the study of Asia. Minority religions, Jainism, Sikhism, Parsi traditions in India. And then something that I've become very conscious of recently and don't know how to solve, indigenous traditions in Asia, ethnic diversity in Burma, in southern China, and in other places. I wish there were a better way to present the full ethnic panoply of diversity in Asia in a course like mine. Why? Because my course is really meant to sensitize people to the differences in different communities in Asia. And without that level of difference, the region becomes homogenized. Now, another question about inclusion is, how is Asia included in the rest of the university and in other parts of our curriculum? This is a big issue for me in the core curriculum. We're beginning to talk about ways of introducing something that might be called an Asian core curriculum in the core, perhaps. Should it be called Asia? What should it be called? My basic instinct follows something that Eugenio once said to me. Whatever we do with Asia in the core curriculum, we simply want more of it. Whatever it is, we want more. That was before we started a very nice dinner. More.
What an Asian thought, yes.
Yes. Anyway, I won't say anything more about that, but you can see that it raises very important questions for us for which there are no obvious answers and yet must be asked, especially as we start a new center. And then another question really has to do with unity and plurality. Are there any unifying interests, institutions, themes, or questions, or whatever, that tie together the diverse aspects of Asia? This is a very serious question that motivated Rabindranath Tagore, Okakura, and Zhang Taiyan. And the third person is one with whom I am much less familiar. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Okakura began a crucial book with the phrase, "Asia is one." Very problematic phrase, but it poses an important question for us. He was reflecting on the Indian idea of Advaita, which actually doesn't mean one, it means not two. Perhaps that's what we're talking about. Anyway, I won't say anything more about that. I have a few more things in my notes about the question of unity and plurality, but I've already spoken too long. Anyway, I think, just practically speaking, that the concept of Asia does have problems. It's a conventional designation, but the fact that it's conventional doesn't mean we shouldn't use it. And we can use it to do very important things for us, to raise critical questions about our own study of Asian traditions and the role of Asia in this university.
Thank you. Thank you for intriguing and very, very interesting points, which we'll open up for discussion after we hear from Rob. The one point I thought was, I've been taken by your image of the mandala. And as maybe an IR person, as soon as you put the mandala and you say there's a center, the political question is who's at the center. And if you think about sort of the politics of Asia, particularly now India,
I would
China,
think Boston
so
University.
yes. I was looking even at a greater stage in the UN, who speaks for Asia, and so very interesting image. But also your question of who is in and who's left out. This particular meeting got started when Eugenio, myself, Joe, we were at one of the board meetings of BUCSA, and that had come the day after Qatar, a small little country in the Gulf, had just been awarded the Football World Cup. And since I happen to follow that sort of thing, Qatar had made the explicit argument that it needed to be held in Asia. The other contenders were Korea and Japan. And Qatar made the explicit argument that Asia is not just Korea, Japan, and China. And so it becomes a very interesting thing. And for the longest of time, I thought this is a particularly Asian thing, particularly in the Middle East, which often gets, themselves don't want to be sometimes identified and so on and so forth. But it's not. I am intrigued how the last 2 weeks we've talked about Egypt without referring to Africa, which it is a part of. Had Egypt happened in Nigeria, we would have been talking about it in African terms, which we haven't in this. So these do have political implications too, but I've said too much. Rob Hefner, former president of the Association of Asian Studies, obviously have thought a lot about this in that and other capacities.
Thank you, and let me thank you, let me thank Shelley, Eugenio, and Joe for this invitation as well. By way of introduction, I might say that the AAS is going to do an Asia Redux and revisit in Honolulu, revisit the topic of what is Asia with a roundtable, including, among others, Prasenjit and a few other people. So it's become quite lively. I've been invited to be the discussant, so that I'll have some sense of where the discussion is going. I was struck by David's image of the Tibetan concept of, was it gur? And I feel in the face of this question, the best I'm going to be doing is a little gur of a gur. That is, it's going to be a moment of a moment. It's not going to be comprehensive, not least of all because the topic is so vast, but also because I was told quite strictly that I was to keep to 10 minutes, and I've kept my remarks, my prepared remarks, worked rather hard to make sure that they fit. So I'm going to be much briefer and I think perhaps less comprehensive than David and Eugenio. The question, obviously, of what is Asia can be interpreted in different ways. I'm a Southeast Asianist first, but a Southeast Asianist who's worked on Pan-Asian varieties of capitalism, who started my career working among a Hindu minority in an Islamizing Java, and the Hindu minority that happened to conceive of itself and its territory around a little volcano in the uplands of East Java in mandala terms. A Hindu minority whose central ritual of invocation of the ancestors was called the Mandaragiri, which means, of course, the Mandalagiri, the sacred mountain, the mountain that churns and from which the universe is born. And then I ended up working among political elites in Singapore and Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, and thinking about trans-regional flows, religious, political, and economic. So I'm someone who I don't think has resolved the question of what is Asia. But I have to say, I don't think it's merely an academic artifice, and I don't think it's a neo-colonial imposition anymore, nor an Orientalist invention, notwithstanding that wonderful genealogy with the Greeks that Eugenio gave us. I think it is a reality, and it's a largely, if not optimistic, it's a breathtaking reality today, and that's what my remarks will be about. Uses their point of departure. Echoing, I think, some of the exchange that Prasenjit Dwara and his colleagues made in the JAS November issue last year. So as I said, I'm a Southeast Asianist, and the thing that strikes us in Southeast Asia, when one looks at Asia, is the fact that Asia was so massively constructed, shaped over the course of 2,000 to 2,500 years through this great arc of commerce and culture that stretched from, yes, India, but also Arabia, down through the islands and maritime ports in mainland Southeast Asia, over to southern and eastern China, and all the way up to Japan. As historians from K.N. Chaduri and to Anthony Reed, Denny Lombard, and a number of others have pointed out, the great pulses that swept across this area brought not only gold, minerals, spices and cloth, but religion, law, and the arts as well, indeed several different waves of them. The Mongol invasions and subsequent European colonialism disrupted this intra-Asian and trans-Asian cultural flow, as well as the flow that I'm not talking about, which was the Silk Road, inland territorial route. But the colonial apparatus that was put in place in the 19th and 20th century in particular also created new Asian diasporas and new Asian movements, including the migration of overseas Chinese, Indians, and Arabs into vast portions of Asia, east and southeast and southern, and who today, Asians, diasporic Asians who emerged to play an integral role in the colonial economy, and then lo and behold, in more recent years, in the last 30 years, have become central players in the new Asian capitalisms, in the plural, because that is what those capitalisms are. So if my first theme today is that Asia is an area that is marked by great cultural, political, and demographic flows, but flows that didn't stabilize the region around a stable cultural essence, but nonetheless kept it in very interesting and dynamic dialogue. The question that it emerges, and this is, I think, how I understood my charge today, is what's the nature of these flows today? What kind of flows are shaping and reshaping Asia across this arc and beyond, obviously, today? For the sake of discussion, I've got about 7 minutes left. Let me highlight 3 currents that I think are particularly decisive. These are rather arbitrary. They reflect in part my own rather too eclectic combination of interests, but I think they speak to some things as well as other currents that I'm not able to talk about. The first, I think, the first current across the area won't surprise anybody. It is, of course, a growing regional economic integration. As Juara points out in his essay in the Journal of Asian Studies, half of Asia's trade flows now take place within Asia, not between Asia and the West. It's a basic transformation that's taken place over just the past 20 years, and it's going to increase rather than decrease. Intra-Asian trade, not just of commodities, but of services, is the wave of the future. Indeed, that future is already here. This trade has both a high and low value added component. An enormous portion of it involves the transfer of primary natural resources from places like Southeast Asia, where I have worked, to Japan, India, and of course the great resource vacuum across Asia, China. As I heard at a ministerial conference that I had the good fortune, it was a rather exceptional experience, to attend, a ministerial conference of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Hanoi this past November. For Southeast Asians and Indians, there were Indians in attendance. That's what ASEAN is doing now. Chinese were not in attendance. It is China's rise that is, of course, provoking the most concern. Singaporeans, not surprisingly, where I've spent 2 years from 97 to 99, or sorry, 2007 to 2009, Singaporeans seem sufficiently confident, indeed even a little excited about China's political and economic rise. Indonesians are mildly concerned. The Vietnamese, Filipinos, and Malaysians seem downright panicked, at least to judge by the comments at this ministerial conference. But the galloping growth of intra-Asian trade and services guarantees that Asia as an economic zone is already second to no part of the world. We all know that, but it's worth stating, I think, in a forum like this. The growth is driving the emergence of cosmopolitan megacities of glass, concrete, optic fiber, and steel like Shanghai, Bombay, and of course Singapore. However, as in Borneo, Indonesian Kalimantan, or the Mekong River Basin, the growth is also creating enormous environmental problems, including deforestation and water shortages. These too are going to be another part, perhaps not so optimistic a part, of Asia, trans-Asia, Asia's future. The boom is also forging new Asian peripheries and subaltern populations whose fate lies in the hands of metropolitan elites who this time around happen to be Asian rather than European. The new Asia is also a second current, is also a river of culture consumption and identity making as well. As the Singaporean sociologist of culture, a friend of mine, Beng Hoak Chua, has observed, one of the most remarkable developments over the past 15 years or so has been the development of pan-East Asian, I emphasize East Asian, entertainment markets and industries. These are imperfectly integrated at best, but nonetheless, they're far more integrated today than they were 25, 35 years ago. Nonetheless, indeed, most strikingly, the popularity of Korean soap operas in Singapore and Indonesia, Chinese martial arts, and Facebook. Indonesia is the third largest user of Facebook in the world.
Now they can follow the Pardee Center?
That's right. All these things bear witness to currents broader than individual nation states. And of course, that's a theme that was emphasized by Duara, the kind of not post-nation state nature of Asian integration, but a complex interdigitation of nation states and trans-regional concerns. The trans-regionalism is also certain, this entertainment industry, trans-regionalism is also certain to grow, but don't expect the homogenization of a pan-Asian entertainment market anytime soon. There's major divisions and tensions. Some pop cultural currents, like Japanese comics, Bollywood films, and kung fu movies, will leap over cultural divides fairly effortlessly, but others, like new fashions in Islamic dress, or lay Buddhist meditation, so popular in Thailand, Burma, and Cambodia, these will not so much be shared as differentiate all the more Asian publics. Time is short, so let me end today with a third current that I wanted to talk about. And this, I've left out the political, you'll note, just because it would have taken too much time. But the third current on which I want to focus is, of course, contemporary religious flows and resurgences, not always flows, but things that sometimes emanate from within national borders. The big news in this regard, and this will surprise nobody in this room, is of course the religious revival in China, arguably the largest taking place right now anywhere in the world, with some 100 or 200 million, we're not really sure, but perhaps 200 million now newly active Buddhists, a larger number, maybe 200 to 400 million people involved in traditionalist Chinese spirit cults and ancestral variation, and most controversially and uncertainly, perhaps 50 to 100 million Chinese who have recently, in addition to a small population that was already there, recently come to identify themselves as Christian, most of them, some variety, but it's a very, very complex variety, some variety of Pentecostals. This cultural current, of course, defies all the shibboleths of modernization theory that most of us worked with a generation or two ago, including, of course, the Marxist version of modernization theory, once popular in China, but as I learned in a visit to the Bureau of Religious Affairs 2 years ago, no longer accepted as adequate for understanding what's taking place. They're post-Marxist on religious matters. Notwithstanding state controls, China's religious resurgence is creating new transnational linkages and social imaginaries to Buddhists in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, to Christians in Korea and the United States, and others. So what's driving this new religiosity? Just a few notes, final notes on that. More important than direct transnational ties, although there are some of those, is the convergence of existential, socio-existential circumstances that we see across Asia, because it's not just China, it's Southeast Asia. South Asia, we can't speak of a revival, it's always been there. But it's still there is a revival taking place in some circles that were previously more vigorously secular. But in any case, what's driving the religious revival across the whole of Asia? And of course, it's happening in other places, other parts of the world. Most among the revitalized religions, I think we should note, tend to be more popular, more voluntary, and more laity-based than the established religions of yesteryears, and established religions that still operate in most of these countries. Many of the new religions, or the revitalized religions, are also marked by the heightened participation of women, although most of these religions don't explicitly affirm any commitment to gender equality, something that sometimes causes tensions in places like Burma and Thailand. Many also appear, and I think this is one of the most striking characteristics of these new varieties of religion, from China to the Philippines, the Pentecostals in the Philippines, all the way over to northern India. One of the most striking things is that many of them, by comparison with their earlier, more elite-based varieties, I'm leaning a little bit in David's directions here, are somewhat more preoccupied with inner worldly well-being, including material well-being. They develop, if you will, prosperity theologies of a Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, or Christian sort. More concerned with this, or as much concerned with this, as with otherworldly transcendence. When they first invited the masses to join them in the Golden Road to modernity, of course, Asia's leaders felt confident that they knew what the proper answer to questions of meaning and public identity were. However, the leadership has discovered, whether it's Asia, whether it's China, Indonesia, whether it's India, Bangladesh, the leadership has awoke to discover, to its surprise, that the political economic developments at the macro level that have so transformed society have had the unintended, unanticipated, and for many, many leaders, unwelcome effect of deepening the popular thirst for spiritual disciplines of not only a more participatory sort, but a more proximate, self-controlled sort in the hands of those who wish to be new believers. As with pop consumption in the commercial sphere, these new religious currents are not likely to make Asia any more homogeneous. Indeed, they will make some Asians more different from one another. Think, for example, of Chinese and Muslims, both experiencing religious revival in a place like Malaysia, and in some ways more different today than they were 30, 40 years ago. What is clear, however, is that the revival will continue to impact debates about citizenship, sociability, commensality, and how to live together, most basically, how to live together in the public sphere. But that's exactly what we should expect of the new Asia, not just economic and entertainment glitz, though there's lots of that, but pervasive debates over the good life and, again, how to live together. Yes, I'm suggesting, and I do think the idea of Asia is an idea worth keeping. Asia is more Asia, more Asian than ever. But we in the West would do well to recognize that it is its own gloriously unstable and pluralized variation on this breathless circumstance, this heady mix of dreamful hope and anxiety that we've experienced too, and that we refer to with the cover term of modernity.
Thank you all. This has been an amazingly rich set of, thank you. We want to open up. I'm sure there are lots of comments. There'll be a mic floating around. Please speak in the mic. It won't do anything to the sound that you hear, but you'll be recorded for posterity. As you think of your questions, let me also just open up and see if any of you have comments on anything. I was very glad you brought the idea of commerce. We don't have an economist here, and I'm looking at Bill by default there. But in many ways in the political world, we are talking about an economic Asia more and more. And I think what in some ways all three of you have reminded us is that we should not be forgetting the religious Asia. This entity has always been defined by that, and as much by the tensions of those religions. And maybe David has a response to this. Am I wrong in thinking that all major religions in the world actually do emanate from Asia? Jerusalem would, by definition, be on whatever your map is, or not? But maybe I'm being too much of a geographer here.
You're not a devotee
Mormonism is a stretch.
You're not a devotee of Nordic mythology.
No, yes. Santa Claus is obviously not Asian.
No, you're right. You're right. If
Actually,
you consider the
yes,
middle.
Yes. St. Nicholas was the bishop of Smyrna in Turkey.
Ah, okay. Okay, would not have guessed from his attire. But wanted to open this up. I mean, in some ways, what I take is that maybe we did get the question wrong. Maybe it's not what is Asia, but what are Asias, and where the center of that mandala goes, either economically or in the glitz of popular culture or whatever. But any comments from the three of you for each other before we open up?
I appreciated Bob's comment about religion in Asia. What's fascinating about it to me is that it is a type of movement that crosses boundaries. So it breaks down national identities and ties people together across those boundaries. But then, of course, as you pointed out, Bob, it also can be used to accentuate national identities. So it's a marvelously ambiguous form of human activity that exemplifies some of the issues that we're talking about.
But is religion more of a unifying force today, or a divisive force?
Unifying.
And I come from Pakistan, so I have a particular take on this.
Of Asia?
Of Asia or within Asia. I mean, how is religion defining Asia today? By creating new fault lines or creating new bridges?
More of a dividing force.
It certainly Southeast Asian Muslims today have a much closer sense of affiliation and identity with South Asian Muslims and Arabian-based Muslims than they did 100, 150 years ago. And of course, there were always some who had a kind of identification with the more global ecumen. But that trans-regional identification with one part of Asia has, in the case of relations with Chinese in much of the region, Chinese who used to sort of move fairly easily into Muslim communities, it's accentuated that division and therefore made relations with locally based Chinese, in some sense, certainly in Malaysia and Indonesia, more difficult. So it depends on which Asia we're assessing and whether it's the consequence of religious revitalization or salience is divisive or uniting.
When you talk about Pentecostal identity, is that transnational? Does it have that effect of tying people together across national boundaries, or is Korean Pentecostalism distinctively Korean and Indonesian Pentecostalism also its own distinctive national variant?
Indonesian Pentecostalism, like Malaysian Pentecostalism, is heavily inflected by Korean Pentecostalism and evangelicalism. One of the most, indeed, trans-regional influences in religious terms is the presence of Christian missionaries from Korea in those areas of Southeast Asia and South Asia where they're allowed to operate. They also have a presence in China. So they are a trans-regional influence, but at the same time, Pentecostalism comes in very, very distinctive forms. In some parts of China today, the varieties of Pentecostalism being professed have such dramatic local indigenous Chinese influences that other Pentecostals are reluctant to regard those brothers and sisters as Pentecostals. They see them as verging on syncretist Christians.
Let me open up. So lots on the plate here, many Asias. Asia, the temple of temples. Asia, the market. Asia, the factory. Asia, the movie maker. Any of those Asias, your take? We'll start from Elaine there, or anyone? We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then come back to you if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Elaine and I'm from the Pardee Center. I'm also from Singapore, and from my personal experience and knowledge of my peer group back in Singapore, I must say that I never thought of myself, first of all, as a Chinese until I went to Australia to do my college studies. Never thought of myself as a Southeast Asian until I joined a research institute that works on Southeast Asian studies, and never thought of myself as an Asian until I came to the US. So anyway, my question for you today is that I can't help but notice that the 3 speakers here are not Asian. I'm just wondering if the conversation today would be different if there's an Asian speaking, and what do you think this means? What is Asia in this room today?
Okay, let's take a few more and we'll come back to that. Michael?
I'm Mike Carroll from the Center for the Study of Asia. There seems to me there's also a tandem question going on in the background here that is very much related to this, and it's the question is, what is Europe? And that you have Turkey trying to join the EU economically, and you've had several centuries of Russia trying to figure out where exactly it divides this line. So I'd like to get, if I could, an additional comment on where exactly does Russia fall in this question, and that 2/3 of Russia's territory is within the boundaries of so-called continental Asia, but nobody brought up Russia at all during the discussion and where exactly it fits into this question in this rubric.
Take maybe one more.
Yes, I'm Rumin Law. I'm doing my PhD in Germany and now visiting Anthropology department in BU. I have 2 thoughts, I think. First, I share the panelist list. I think the Asian is more Asian now, but I don't know whether we really consider Asia now. Consider by not comparing to the another continent. So such like what we're discussing now in about Europe or Africa, because Europe and Africa was really historically really constructed. But I don't know what Asia now is in currently contemporary discussion. It's more constructed now. It's because of its economic integration, such like because of the more consensus in the global South. So Asians thinks that we need to unite, or we need to integrate now, or just because of the discourses construction, and we think it's Asia now you should compare to or should compare or compete to the Asia, to the Europe or to the Africa. And second thought is that I don't know whether we see, whether the panelists really see any possibility of the Asian really integration. I mean, especially economically or politically, because just now we are talking about China rise, and so maybe the people thinking about China as a danger now, but still many countries, such like in South Asia, they are thinking that they need to economically to integrate into China, or they need to have the cooperation in order to get more economic development. Thanks.
Three interesting questions. We'll take more, but I'll give time to the panelists. Just one comment on Elaine's comment. I hope my Asianness comes through. And if Eugenio is right that Asia is a European artifact, then the panel is, I think, exactly right. But ultimately, I hope sort of your Asianness comes not just from a birth certificate, but the passion of your, the intensity of your passions for the region, which is amply demonstrated here. But any of you. Also, if I can, I also wonder, even in our conversation, if we are taking integration as necessarily the goal, as if you share an identity, then the ultimate goal must be to integrate. I'm not sure that's a valid proposition to even begin with. But any responses to any of the thoughts?
Well, the only voices that are Asian in our debate today certainly are those in the forum. And for example, going back to the Chinese intellectual Wang Hui, his position is that the nation state is here to stay, and that the idea of Asia continues to be the main force in Asian relations. And so this also is a very intellectual kind of construct that remains the preserve of government officials, of intellectuals, and doesn't go down to the masses. So our friend from Singapore, as a person walking in the streets of Singapore, maybe never conceived of herself as Asian until you had to meet with the other. And usually that's when, in historical terms, you identify yourself. When you meet with something else that somehow hardens your own identity. What the forum says, and I think historians agree with this, is that in pre-modern times, these boundaries were very soft. Very often you did not identify with anything but a dynasty, for example. You wouldn't think of yourself as Chinese, but rather a subject of the Qing emperor. That mattered for you. You were from the province of such and such, Fujian.
You remembered the birthday of Zahiruddin Babur.
You didn't even speak the same language. And it didn't matter because the empire was this soft place that allowed for this diversity. It is modernity, and that's the word that concluded Bob's intervention, that brought more of a hardening of this. So I think that in part responds to the fact that we as who is here sitting today. Yeah.
Any thoughts about whether Russia should be included in the conversation?
Haven't we got enough problems without that?
That's right.
That's well said. I'll make two comments. One is about would the presence of people of a Asian national background make a difference? Presumably it would, but I think probably in a more complex way than a simple interpretation of your question, and I'm not saying that was the meaning you had in mind, but a simple interpretation of your question might imply ideas, sensibilities, what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls habituses, differentiate much more than do the simple facts of skin color, even language. One has to look at language in relation to deep-seated habituses, and I think one can say the presence of people with, in addition to Adil, as I must call him, since I work in Southeast Asia and I can't call.
He's one of the few people who says my name exactly right, so please keep saying it. It would make a difference, but again, in a very complicated way. Ideas and sensibilities differentiate, and it would depend upon the sensibilities that people bring. And what we've sought to emphasize, and I think what the Prasenjit and the contributors to the JAS volume emphasized, is that Asia is both in complex
interaction, as it has, many of its regions have long been, but it hasn't stabilized around a common core. So those sensibilities that different authors bring would be different.
But David, if I can point towards Michael's question, that isn't Europe sort of hanging over our discussion still, that Eugenio is right, that Asia is the other, that when we talk of the rise of Asia, we're really talking about the fall of the West, if you will, or not of the fall, but certainly the lessening of the rise of the West. Isn't all of this conversation in that shadow, whether you include Russia or not?
Well, I took that to be one of the points in Tuara's initial article, that at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with people like Tagore and Okakura, there was an attempt to say, we are here, we're different, and someone needs to pay attention to us. That is, there's a certain kind of cultural integrity and depth and seriousness in our tradition that stands over against what is being imposed on our region. And I suggested in my talk, I didn't want to be too heavy-handed about this, but I suggested in my talk that that's part of our reason for raising this question. Here we are in the university. There are important programs that all of us have connections with, where what we represent in Asia, or in the different modes of Asia that we represent, should be taken more seriously. And so it's important for us to name Asia, to speak about it, to bring it more forcefully into conversation with all the other cultural, intellectual traditions that we relate to in the university.
I wanted to come back to your question as to whether a sub-premise was whether Asia should and is in the process of integrating more. My paper, though too abbreviated, was trying to address that question, or that series of questions, quite specifically. And again, I think the answer is going to be mixed. Asia, particularly resource producing and Chinese product consuming and Indian software consuming or sharing parts of Asia. There are processes of integration at work that are very, very strong. But again, in the culture sphere, and I took the entertainment industry as a specific and deliberate example, in the culture sphere there's going to be both the mix of more integration, those Korean soap operas popular in some parts of Southeast Asia, and particularly in Buddhist Southeast Asia. But in other areas you're going to have greater resistance, a greater sense of difference. Clifford Geertz, many years ago, I'm not a Geertzian, but I knew Cliff, and he was nonetheless, because he's an Indonesianist and he works on Islam, it was a major influence on me, even when I disagreed with him. But many years ago, 40 years ago, he said, this sense of a really clear ethnic and/or national identity, that's a modern phenomenon. It reflects new styles of interaction and integration. And it's not just the nation state, and it's not just ethnicity. There are new kind of both transnational and subnational or infranational identities emerging, not least of all, or most easily sort of illustrated in the sphere of religion. I can remember sitting in the house of, I was interviewing a Salafi Muslim, a very strict constructionist, Saudi schooled Muslim in Indonesia, and he did watch TV, which many Salafis don't, because they just reject it as a kind of Western. And I asked him about the TV, and he said, oh, no, I watch TV, and I'm not that strict. It's okay. You know this show? And he looked at me, he knew I was American. He says, you know this show, Little House on the Prairie? Now, this was a very Muslim show. This was a very Muslim show. And after I got my jaw back up and sort of said, okay, yeah, I understand.
We would have to ask Laura Ingalls about that, yes.
He said, but these soap operas from China and Korea, he said, these are very un-Islamic. They're all about sex and romance, not about family values. Again, that's a silly illustration of a process that can take place and is taking place in some parts of Southeast and South Asia, where a sense of a certain kind of Muslim identity, Islam is varied, but a certain kind of Muslim identity has actually become stronger and more oppositional relative to that the other that it confronts.
We'll take one more round of questions. Actually, we may even have more. The gentleman there.
My name is Dennis Wu from Communication, and I just encountered an official definition from the U.S. Census about what is Asian Asian American. And the definition, according to the census, is that all the people east of Pakistan are considered Asian. West of Pakistan are considered Caucasian. So I had to use that kind of definition in my research project, but I want to see what your reaction to this official definition about Asian.
We'll take more. If I can just jump in on that, I did a book on diaspora philanthropy and realized that the official term for someone like me till I think 1942 in the US was Indian Hindu. And Hindu had nothing to do with religion because Indian was kind of taken. So Hindu was a geographic entity. It had nothing to do with, and you find these passages from people in California where this woman who's a Mexican who's married to an Indian Hindu who happens to be a Muslim and has just gone to mosque. And it all gets confused because the official definition had to sort of deal with this other entity. I'm sorry I jumped in there, but we'll take a few more.
Me?
Yeah, please, please, and then we'll come to Joe.
I do not have any specific question to any of the speakers because the topic is so vast. I mean, one can go on asking questions to the speaker or to myself. I have a couple of modest comments. First, the thesis of my comment is that the future of Asia is the future of world. Reason being, A, 60% population live over there. The largest number of land force army is there. Largest source of energy is there. 5 major religions of the world is there. And to add the last is today's Wall Street Journal. Today is the Babur's birthday, according to Adil. And today is the Valentine's Day. That is also true. But today, officially, China declared that we are the second largest economy. And our economy is 7.8% larger than Japan. So taking Japan and China together, it is almost close to the total economy of United States. Only difference is that United States owes $3.2 trillion in cash. So the importance of Asia is tremendous in academia, in politics, in international relations. So all the 3 speakers, and of course Professor Najam is giving due importance of the study of Asia. But I have noticed that Professor David Eckel, time and again, giving emphasis that Asia should be a major area of discourse and study in the university level all over, including Boston University. I taught in Boston University for 22 years. It was very difficult on my part to give the course in every year in one semester because the honorable administration thought that, well, 1 in 2 years, right, that is good enough. I say that is bad enough. There should be a more course on Asia, right?
More.
So I
He owns that word.
I'll be very short. I will take this opportunity to request Professor Adil Najam that it is not just one seminar. There can be a series of seminars on Asia. Today, if it is a 7 chapters book, I will say it's the first chapter. Because all the 3 honorable speakers, they have simply defined, right? There are many issues in Asia, we all know. There is the issue of prosperity, there is the issue of poverty, there is the issue of environment, but there is also an issue of transboundary problem between and among the countries' environment, right? So to make the long story short, I hope that this center will organize more seminars on not just what is Asia, but what is the future of Asia, right? And how much we should learn about Asia. China alone has got 1.92 trillion worth of trade by water, right? So without knowing the geography of Asia, right, we know nothing about the trade of Asia, right? So to end it, I would expect that there will be more seminar on this topic, and eventually Professor Najam will
take it to Joe Fewsmith, who can tell us about how many seminars they're all always happening. Yes.
I want to welcome you to all of our BU Center for the Study of Asia seminars. We had 45 of them in the fall. So we're working on that. I agree. I'm by no means making light. I certainly agree in our center. like Adil Center is dedicated to this. And I sort of want to pick up on some of your comments and what David said about the people like Tagore and others sort of standing up and saying, no, wait, our tradition is worth studying. And that relates to what we do in the university here. And it's not just studying Chinese or Muslim or any other philosophy. In the philosophy department, in the Department of Political Science, for some reason, which I do not understand, political philosophy is meant to be Western political philosophy. And I don't understand. Is the West the only part of the world that has a tradition of governance? Confucian philosophy, Islamic philosophy, Indian philosophy are not worth studying as a political philosophy in the Department of Political Science. It seems to me to disaggregate and cut apart different ways of conceiving of governance. We teach comparative politics, but we don't teach comparative governance in a philosophical sense. And I think so there's ways that we can reconceive what we do in the university, and that's what I think this conversation's so important about.
Yeah, agreed, Joe.
We'll take one more, Shelley, and then we'll come back to our guests.
Yes. I'm Shelley Hawks, Associate Director of the Boston University Center for Study of Asia, and thank you that we have such expertise on Asia here at Boston University. I was particularly intrigued by David Eckel's comments about using Buddhist strategies for conceiving Asia. And the images that you raised, the mandala or the rivers, I think those images create such a sense of spaciousness and interconnection. And it made me think about some writing by Peter Berger or Max Weber in terms of setting up ideas and images in the collective imagination and the extent to which that really can influence reality. And I just wondered if you thought, I would be interested in the whole panel's ideas about the way that these kind of conceptions could affect reality in terms of water resource management across Asia or cooperation in environmental matters. What does it, do you really believe that actually these ideas and metaphors and strategies can have an effect on empirical reality?
Any and all.
Empirical reality really is the province of the professor who sits to my right. So we'll have to pass this on to him in a moment, but just to take the issue of water resource management, it's a major concern in Southeast Asia. I know that the Mekong is being dammed farther up the river, and that Cambodia and Laos are concerned about that. The resource management is one of the places, of course, where transnational issues come most into play. And whether you think of Asia as being a network or whether you think of it as simply a series of huge streams where the metaphor of the stream becomes the reality of the stream, it is a place where people need to negotiate and cooperate in ways that Professor Hefner will be able to explain to us.
Rob. I'm not sure I can, but certainly I do believe that ethical ideas, both religious and general, of course, they make an enormous difference. They don't make an enormous difference, however, in the absence of social carriers and institutions and powers that project them and draw them into life in substantive ways. And that then becomes the question, not whether ethical ideas and religious ideals and others, let's call them public ethical ideas, recognizing religion as a subcategory of them. It's not the question of whether these things will influence empirical questions, struggles for the environment, for social justice, and or for or against women's rights, because the religious ethics go in different directions. The question isn't whether those influences will be there. The question is what social carriers animated by what public ethical projects and normative visions in a very practical way prove decisive in the addressing of issues like water resource management in the Tibetan Plateau or along the Mekong River. I mean, Bangladesh is facing, as you know, Adil better than anyone, facing very, very serious future as China contemplates damming some of its rivers up that flow into Bangladesh. So in any case, the question is which values carried by which social actors, and that's, if you will, an agenda for research. And it's a research that's been done, I might add, not to claim any credit. It's a general concern, obviously, for the sociology of religion and political scientists to work on questions of ethics and public ethics and democracy, public ethics and non-democracy. So it's out there. These are central concerns. And I would just say, as an observer of academic life for some 30 plus years now, I have been struck by the extraordinarily heightened interest in ethical and religious ideas and the recognition that religion matters. But again, it's how it matters. We have to develop tools for analyzing how it matters that proves decisive.
And Shelley, I would add to that too, concern not just simply about natural resources, but as it were, ethnic and cultural resources. I don't spend an awful lot of time in Asia speaking to people who are concerned about international development and aid and refugee concerns and other such things. I work with monks and philosophers most of the time. But I was so deeply touched in Bangkok just a few years ago when I met with some people who were attempting to simply relieve the suffering of the ethnic minorities that were being suppressed, destroyed by the Burmese military government. I wish we had more ways at BU to raise awareness and sensitivity about the needs of that other precious resource in Asia that is being so deeply stressed and damaged by the spread of modernity in its many modes.
If I can add one thing that is very practical, I would say maybe we can change that question to what is Asia a BU? This seems to be actually something that many of you have pointed to. And I think that our student groups who have a Korean president, an Indian treasurer, a Chinese PR person, someone who is Persian but studies Korean and is fluent in it. That represents, I think, at a very practical level here, what we want this idea of Asia to be. At the level of faculty is similar. I am in a study group where I study Qing dynasty court. There's a colleague who is Gujarati but studies Persian, who studies Mughal and Persian court culture, a Turkish friend who does Ottoman court, a white American Caucasian who studies Japanese courts. Now, it's Asia that's changing us. Some of these people are Asian, some are not, but I think, you know, maybe it might sound a little bit idealistic, but we have to start from breaking down these hard barriers amongst ourselves, and then whatever it's out there will come back and reach us.
And the same change is happening within Asia. You know, I mean, this is just an aside, but not an unimportant one. Me and my wife, when we first came to Cambridge, really liked this one Chinese restaurant. And we were always surprised that no one else seemed to. It was always empty. It's on Mass Ave. And then we realized the reason we really liked it was it felt like Pakistani Chinese food. Which probably had nothing to do with what Chinese food is. And the same is with Indian. You know, having red chicken is a particularly Massachusetts phenomena, not as much related to food in India. So in some way, sort of these concepts also get mashed up. But I do wonder, you know, last summer, Shakira sort of defined Africa in this song. You know, here you have a Latin American, Waka Waka. You know, the theme song for the Football World Cup. But it was really an African song, and there was an African sensibility to that moment when the Football World Cup was happening. I do not think that can happen in Asia. Maybe we are too big. Maybe there are multiple Asias, or maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know about finding an equivalent to Shakira, But if I could go back to Singapore briefly, Singapore wants to present itself as the Shakira, at least in academic and commercial terms.
Or Malaysia,
for Asia.
all of Asia.
The Singaporeans are, their intellectual and business and political establishment is, first of all, very, very impressive, has really transformed their sense of where they want to position Singapore in terms of the arts, in terms of academia, in terms of commerce. They want to position this. This sounds too grandiose to be believed, but actually they're taking very, very impressive measures. They want to position Singapore as not just a commercial and banking hub, but as a hub, as a kind of crossroads between East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And of course, they look to their own population and say, we've got the resources. It sounds empty, but if you look at what they've done, it nonetheless has very, very interesting effects in the way in which they're trying to build business context. They've got, of course, the investment in China. What's new is they're now going into India. And they're so skilled, they're making great progress. Equally important, as I said, academically, they've built, of course, I think you may have, I don't know your name, I'm sorry, you may have been referring to the Asia Research Institute. That's what it's called at the National University of Singapore, which is a very, very impressive place, and which has, interestingly, recently shifted from having what was Singapore's and the NUS's, the National University of Singapore's earlier focus on Southeast Asia, to now really highlighting India and China, but then, of course, maintaining that academic interest in Southeast Asia. So Shakira it is not. I mean, Shakira is a hard act to follow. But there is something in the air in some parts of Asia. Malaysia's trying this. China. There are academic centers in China, Fudan University being one, which are attempting, they're not Singapore, but they're attempting to sort of develop not just kind of business ties, but an intellectual, aesthetic, and political sensibility, which is that of a cosmopolitan Asia.
Let me end with one last question for all three of you, a very Pardee Center type of question. We hear a lot of this talk about Asia rising. When you hear Asia rising, how do you react to that? Do you roll your eyes and say, been there, done that, seen that before, these guys will wake up again? Is this real? And what does it mean for Asia, and what does it mean for the rest of Asia? This goes to Professor Hasnath's question. The numbers are astounding. The population numbers, the wealth numbers, the military numbers, all of these numbers are astounding. But within Asia, at least one part of the question is, when one part of Asia rises, what happens to the rest of Asia? Right? So if you're not India, and if you're a Bangladesh or a Pakistan, when the India rises and sort of spreads its arms, and so on and so forth. But when you hear, as people who have studied Asia for so long, when you hear this term Asia rising, what are the images that come to your mind, or what are the thoughts?
That's an old story, in the sense that 200 years ago, Asia was the hub of the world, was at this economic center of the world. And historians in the last decade or so have produced this sweeping analysis, the California School of Kenneth Pomeranz being one. Here at BC there is Prasannan Parthasarathi, who is producing our book, where they really are telling us the story of the world in the long durate, in the long term. And they are telling us this is simply going back to a cycle of normality. It is the last 200 years that were not normal. Now, do we buy that or no? I think there is a lot of debate about this, but I think there is some wisdom in looking at the long-term cycles and seeing this maybe as a return to normality.
We see the wisdom of long-term very much here in this building. David, Asia rising.
I'm intrigued by one comment that you made when you raised the question, is when Asia rises, what happens to the configuration of powers within Asia? Does that mean that China is rising and India is falling behind? Or within India, as India rises, who falls behind in India? It simply brings into focus for me questions about sub-regions within Asia.
Asia is rising. And it's rising not just because of the political power of the two superpowers, or soon-to-be superpowers if we include India, but also because, and not just because of economic power, but actually most interestingly, because of really recent developments. And here I don't think we should make too much of the 200-year cycle. Yes, that's real, but there is something thoroughly new, and that's the development of new knowledge industries. and the shift of knowledge industries and the sophistication of knowledge industries. And I mean not just computers and technology, I mean human resources. The kind of human resources that are being developed in Singapore, in Bombay, in Shanghai, in Beijing are on the cusp of being second to none. And if they continue the trajectory that they've had over the last 20 years, we will not see, sadly, quite this, let me say 30 years, in the next 30 years, we will not see, sadly, the same numbers of Asian students coming to Ivy League and East Coast campuses to pursue their studies, because large numbers of them will be going to Fudan and Renmin and certainly the National University of Singapore.
Thank you all. This has been a tremendously, amazingly rich conversation. Please join me in thanking all three of you. Just to say, to echo, I'm not going to summarize, but to echo what Eugenio has been saying more, but the good news is the Center for Study of Asia is doing an amazing lot of work on this. The Cura, which Rob heads, is doing an amazing amount of interesting things also unrelated to this. The core curriculum we hear is going to be...
just get the core in the mixture.
There is more needed, but there is more happening at this university as elsewhere. We will continue these discussions again and again. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil.